How much does Stanley Cup Final experience matter in this instance? We're going to discuss that more here on the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast.
Your Locked On Panthers, your daily podcast on the Florida Panthers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And welcome into this Wednesday, June 5th edition of the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where it's your team every day. Thank you for making the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast your first listen of the day. I'm Armando Velez from the Hockey News, and you can follow me on X at Monoman12, follow the show account on X and Instagram at LO_FL8 Panthers, and shout out to the everydayers who come back here and get your daily Florida Panthers fix. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any $5 bet. That's $150 with any $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. So, Cats fans, good morning, everybody, and hope you are doing well today as we are still 3 days away from Game 1 of the Stanley Cup Final between the Florida Panthers and the Edmonton Oilers, and just a little impatient on my end of things. I'm sure a lot of you guys are feeling that too, right before Game 1, as the Florida Panthers will be hosting the first 2 games of this Stanley Cup Final. But it is a Wednesday, which means it is a Winans Wednesday edition of the show, which means Jacob Winans is back here. Jacob, welcome back to the show, my friend, and glad to have you here, my friend.
Yeah, thank you for having me as usual. And man, it's always a blessing that we're getting to talk Panthers hockey in June. We've got a Stanley Cup Final coming up. This is the most exciting time of year, and only 2 teams get to say that, and we're one of them.
No doubt. And if you're watching on the YouTube and you see that the green background is here instead of something usual in the background, my Florida Everblades shirt is transparent with the green screen. It is a Florida Everblades game day. So if you happen to be going to Hertz Arena tonight, wear green if you are going, as the series is tied at 1 between the Blades and the Kansas City Mavericks. But let's go right into the some of the updates for the Panthers going out of Tuesday's practice going into Wednesday. Barkov and Kulikov had some maintenance days yesterday, so they will be fine going into the rest of the week and getting some of their reps. Like Paul Maurice said a few days ago, it's all about video right now for the Panthers and getting their game right and just looking at how they're going to stop McDavid and Draisaitl. That's the biggest key. But for the other side of things, for the Edmonton Oilers and Kris Knoblauch, there was a comment that made the rounds on social media yesterday of something that Kris Knoblauch said about looking at the Panthers and Stanley Cup experience from last year and whether that matters to them or not. And Kris Knoblauch said a comment saying, ask the Buffalo Bills of the 90s how much experience matters. The Dolphin fan in me looked at that and wanted to laugh a little bit at the Bills, because I've been giving some of their fans crap for years about 4 straight Super Bowls and not winning a single one. But I just can't all of a sudden turn around and say, just because someone is saying it about the hockey team that I follow, I to be offended by it. It's like, why would you say such a thing? But I do think he has a point here for his comments, is that the Panthers aren't entitled to anything just because they're back. But it's been a while too. The last time a team lost back-to-back Stanley Cup Finals wasn't since the 70s. The Boston Bruins, where they lost both times to the Montreal Canadiens in those years. And also, we spoke about the Penguins coming back even in 2009. You could ask Dan Bylsma, Sidney Crosby, Evgeny Malkin. Even then, they're not entitled to winning neither, just because they got to that road back. So I think it's more of a humbling comment if you're a Panthers fan receiving that. At least that's the way I'm viewing it for that. But how'd you see that comment from Kris Knoblauch going into Tuesday's practice into the Stanley Cup Final?
I don't think there was anything necessarily ill intent wise from him. I don't think it's a shot at the Panthers. I don't think it was anything that he's saying trying to stir the pot.
No.
I think it's more about making sure his team knows that we're on equal footing. It doesn't matter what they did last year. We're equals here, and they have just as good of a chance of winning this as the Panthers do, despite the fact that the Panthers were there last year. So I don't think there was anything meant by it that should have caused any issue. But it's a slippery slope because this time of year, anyone's looking for anything to take and use as bulletin board material. The Panthers are a team that are definitely going to hear that comment and have something to say about it. And it's going to be in the back of their minds, and you don't want to add any fuel to that fire. You don't want to give your opposition any added motivation. And I think that's exactly what that comment's going to do, whether it was meant to or not. And I think also just, well, yes, it makes sense, and it's a humbling comment, and it is the reality of the situation. I don't think that's a lesson the Panthers necessarily need. The Panthers know that they're not entitled to winning. Nothing teaches you that more than getting there and losing. They got to the Stanley Cup Final last year and lost, and they know that just getting there isn't enough, and that they aren't entitled to win just because they made it there. So the only thing that could make sense for me is that comment was aimed at his own team. Know that it's equal footing, but if that's a comment that was meant to perk up the ears of any Panthers, I don't think it. I really don't think it will. There's nothing that can be said externally that's going to change the mission at hand for what the Panthers players have, and if anything, it might add a little bit of bulletin board material, fuel to the fire, whatever you want to call it. But at the end of the day, it's a nothing comment to me, and just something that us fans can talk about, and people can get upset about it and add a little bit more intrigue to the series. But I really don't think the players care that much. They know the goal at hand here.
Yeah, we don't get the sense that this isn't an arrogant group for the Panthers, knowing that even though Matthew Tkachuk says, "I told you we'll be back," it's not really for him. It's just the belief in this group, and knowing that him missing the last part of the final game of the Stanley Cup Final too. That's another factor there, and just knowing that it just gets, when you have that target on your back, that's what makes it harder to get back. I mean, think about this: before Wayne Gretzky won, he lost against the New York Islanders in '83, and then came back and beat them the very next year too. So that's another thing for Gretzky there for them, and also, I mean, for Connor McDavid going into this one, and the Edmonton Oilers, both in the last few years have lost to eventual Stanley Cup champions. I mean, the Edmonton Oilers lost to Colorado, and then Vegas in back-to-back years. The Panthers lost to the Lightning in 2021, and then obviously the Vegas Golden Knights in last year's matchup. So both of these teams have, even though Edmonton hasn't made a final recently, that's another. You're still getting those battles that maybe a lot of people from the outside say maybe that was the real Stanley Cup Final 2021. A lot of people were saying round one for the Panthers, that was the best matchup that the Tampa Bay Lightning had their whole playoff run too. So it's really about, these two teams have been scratching the surface. And I even said this even before Game 5 with Jeremy Taché of Bally Sports Florida. Even when the Panthers were down 3-1, this was a matter of the Panthers getting there, just scratching the surface. Did I necessarily predict that the Panthers will be back in the Stanley Cup Final preseason? Not necessarily, but also just about knocking on the door and just trying to knock it down. And the fact that these two teams have had a series where losing to eventual champions, it makes it for a more intriguing matchup now that these two teams are now meeting.
Yeah, there's so many storylines with this series that make this such an interesting matchup, from the Tkachuk, Bennett, Lomberg, Calgary days to the McDavid, Draisaitl first Stanley Cup appearance. There's so many things, but when you look at the playoff experience for both of these groups, that's one thing that makes it really, really interesting. Like you said, both teams have lost to eventual Stanley Cup champions. Both teams have had deep runs in the past couple of years and have just been waiting to break through. Both teams also, the cores of both of these teams are also very similar in age and draft class, and just sort of the cup window. It's very similar for both of these teams. The Panthers' cornerstone players are drafted between 2013 and 2015, 2016. Same can be said for Edmonton. You've got McDavid, you've got Draisaitl, who was part of the Ekblad, Sam Bennett, Sam Reinhart class. That was the top 4 of the 2014 draft. It's so interesting seeing how it almost feels like things sort of aligned timeline wise for this matchup to happen. It was the two teams that were rebuilding at the exact same time. Now making it to the final at the exact same time, and that's really how it's supposed to go on paper, and it's cool to see that matchup come to fruition. For the Panthers, at least, it's not exactly how you would expect it to happen. A lot of the guys that were carrying on to this roster into the final were not necessarily drafted by the Panthers, but team building and smart trades, the smartest waiver claim of the decade. And Gus Forsling, there's a lot of guys here that weren't necessarily part of the picture when this rebuild started for the Panthers years ago, but they're here now, and I think the timelines worked out pretty nicely to get these two teams in the finals against each other. I'm super excited. Just the matchups that we could see here it's going to be great hockey. If I wasn't a fan of the Panthers, I'd probably be even more excited because I would get to watch this stress-free. It's going to be some incredible hockey, but as a Panthers fan, I'm going to be on pins and needles this whole time.
Yeah, and the fact that it's almost a decade later for both of these teams matching up, and questions of whether they would knock the door off. But we're going to transition over to segment number 2. Where we're going to discuss the different levels of pressure that each team and individual players will be facing in this Stanley Cup final. We're going to discuss that and more here on the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. And it's winner take all in the NBA and the NHL, and FanDuel is giving you a shot to bring home a big win of your own. Right now, new customers get a $150 in bonus bets with any $5 bet. And if you want to sprinkle in some of your bets for the Stanley Cup final, the Panthers are favored minus 128 for the Stanley Cup final. And you could do that all at FanDuel. That's $150 to bet on spreads, money lines, player props, and more. So visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make every playoff shot count. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Welcome back to this Wednesday, June 5th edition of the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast. Thank you once again for making the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast your first listen of the day. And are you watching Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day? How did you turn down the volume with all that shouting? Make the switch to Locked On Sports today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel programmed for you every day to bring you the latest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you the can't miss analysis, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Back with Jacob Winans here on another edition of Winans Wednesday to discuss more about the Stanley Cup final, which we're still quite a few days away. But Jacob, let's talk about pressures for both teams and even individuals. There's no question. I'm not even going to argue who has the most pressure of anyone between the two teams. It's Connor McDavid going from being the prodigy from the time he was a little boy and having that label of generational talent. In a few years, Connor Bedard is going to be feeling that pressure right now. Even in the last decade plus, we've only really, the conversation about generational players has really, you can only list maybe 5 people, 5 guys who you're labeled generational talent when it comes to #1 overall pick: Ovi, Crosby, McDavid, and Bedard. Those are the ones that have had that pre-draft hype as far as the most. But let's talk about different types of pressures that different guys are feeling, and the noise is outside of them. We talk about high salaried guys in Sergei Bobrovsky on the Panthers, Darnell Nurse on the Edmonton Oilers, getting a big payday, and heard a lot of the noise from even before when the Edmonton Oilers were in that series against the Dallas Stars. Very short with the media. Bobrovsky, very even-keeled. We heard all the noise in the first few years of his $10 million contract. And also, Torts had a great comment about Sergei Bobrovsky, discussing how he's the most prepared athlete Ken Holland, I know he's a Hockey Hall of Famer for being a builder and all those years being in Detroit and even here in Edmonton, but also Matthew Tkachuk too. There's a bad taste in the mouth of Calgary Flames fans, but a good taste in the mouth of Edmonton Oilers fans about how that series ended in 5 games. A very high scoring game in game 1. It was 9-7, I believe that was the final score. And then Edmonton won the last 4 games in a gentleman's sweep there for them. But also, Calgary fans will be watching to see whether they told you so about Matthew Tkachuk's playoff performance, but also they're probably cheering for the Panthers too, some of them. But also Senators fans are watching for bragging rights of who the better Tkachuk brother is, even though Matthew's been to the playoffs more often. So that's another thing there for pressures there. So that's another thing when it comes to the pressures of different types of players. There's also, for the Panther side of things, OEL being a first round pick and things not working out in Arizona and being bought out by the Vancouver Canucks. So that's another type of pressure for someone like Oliver Ekman-Larsson too. Ekblad being a number 1 overall pick, but not necessarily having the being like a Cale Makar or Roman Josi there. And we heard a lot of noise, even though Ekblad had a great series against the New York Rangers. There was a lot of noise around him in the second round series against the Bruins. So those are the different levels of pressure that each individual player is experiencing, and even the noise from the outside. For in your perspective, what are the different pressure points and different individual players or even coaches that you're seeing in this Stanley Cup Final matchup?
Yeah, so anytime you get to this level, there's going to be team pressure and there's going to be individual pressure. And I think the individual pressure comes from mainly just your career arc and where you've come from in your career. And some guys can take this all the way back to their childhood. We obviously don't know everyone's childhood backstory, but if you just look at the NHL level, this is a chance for the ultimate validation for so many guys. And it starts from the coaching staff down. So if you look at like Paul Maurice, for example, he's one of the winningest coaches in NHL history. He's also the losingest coach in NHL history. And he also he doesn't have a Stanley Cup yet to his resume. For the amount of years he's coached, he's never won the ultimate prize. That's high pressure. Kris Knoblauch was an interim head coach hire midseason. It's for him. It's the validation that he belongs. That he's an NHL head coach. Connor McDavid, number 1 pick. He's done everything you can possibly do except win a Stanley Cup. That's high pressure. Like you said, Aaron Ekblad, he's facing off against a guy who was drafted after him, which every single redraft of that 2014 NHL draft has Leon Draisaitl going number 1 instead of Aaron Ekblad. He has a chance to go against the guy that everyone says is better than him and should have been picked before him in that draft. Sam Bennett, discarded by Calgary, considered a bust. He has a chance to beat the ultimate rival of Calgary after Calgary basically threw him away for nothing. Sam Reinhart was a guy who was seen as a disappointment in Buffalo, never really worked out there. He has a chance to win a cup. There's countless guys. Brandon Montour, a guy who was seen as one of the worst defensemen in the league when he was in Buffalo, and now has a chance to win a cup as a key piece of the team. There's so many guys, especially on the Panthers side, that have a lot to prove by getting their name on that cup. But we definitely can't discredit what the Oilers have. Darnell Nurse has overcome a ton this postseason. His numbers have looked bad. His game has looked bad at certain times. But he stepped up in the last few games of that Dallas series, and he's trying to silence the doubters. He's going to play a ton of minutes. That's his game. He's going to play a lot of minutes, and he's going to be a motivated guy. Ryan Nugent-Hopkins, he's a guy who was a first overall pick and didn't necessarily live up to the superstar potential people had for him. He has a chance to so many people that have so much riding on this from a team perspective and a personal perspective. It adds to the intrigue of the series because everyone has their own own validation that they're looking for, and to put a cap on everything they've worked for their career and for their life, and to prove so many people wrong. It's tough to measure that because both teams have it. And I think the only way to approach it is to try not to think too much about the personal parts of it, and focus on the team goal, because that's kind of what's gotten them there. And the Panthers are such a tight knit team. I can't see any of them straying from that at this point.
Mm-hmm. And also, Stuart Skinner is another one. Young goaltender trying to prove that he is the guy too. That's another guy who has a lot of pressure. And also, the Edmonton Oilers could have drafted Matthew Tkachuk too in 2016. That was the Jesse Puljujarvi pick that Edmonton had, and there's a lot of talk about analytics looking great for Puljujarvi, but finishing wasn't there. Goes to Carolina and now was up and down with the Pittsburgh Penguins this last year too. That was the same draft as Austin Matthews too. That very same draft too so the Edmonton Oilers had their chance to do it.
And one other thing that hasn't gotten a ton of attention, but you can tell it means a lot to the Panthers. This seems to be Kyle Okposo's last year. Mm-hmm. And he's such a well-respected guy. And I feel like the Panthers, it's not talked about much, but I really get the sense that the Panthers are putting a lot of stock in trying to get him a Stanley Cup on his way out. It seems to be a bigger thing internally than externally. It's not discussed as much outside, but I really get the sense that means a lot to this group.
And you could tell based on the trophy ceremony for the Prince of Wales, mm-hmm. where you see people, where you see them saying, "Okie, come over here. We want you at least in the front." So short time with the Panthers, and he's just so well respected around it. Just an overall good guy in the NHL, and a guy that a lot of people love too. So that's another thing when it comes to just the respect factor that the team all has for Kyle Okposo. But we're going to transition over to segment number 3, where we're going to discuss more about the circumstances for the Panthers coming into this one versus last year. We are going to discuss that and more next on the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast. Segment number 3 here on this Wednesday, June 5th edition of the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast. Thank you once again for making the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast your first listen of the day here on a Wednesday, and a Winans Wednesday edition of the show. So, rewatching some of the media availability from yesterday, and Paul Maurice also spoke about the time off that both teams are going to have. There's no advantage, disadvantage this time around, and we were waiting, and it was 8 days between the Panthers clinching against the Hurricanes versus game 1 of the Stanley Cup Final. And time off did not matter for the Panthers' injuries. I mean, let's also take into consideration that Eetu Luostarinen is going to play in the Swiss Army knife for the Florida Panthers, who can go up and down. Same thing with bringing in Evan Rodriguez into the mix, using that Duclair money wisely, going into that. So that's another thing for the Panthers, and getting someone who can drive play a little bit more for the Panthers. And also the fact that for the Panthers, it took a while for them to kind of get things going, not to the point of 2022, 2023, where they started off very poorly, obviously trying to get acclimated to a new system. But Matthew Tkachuk took a while to get going based on the sternum injury. A lot of us, including myself, were wondering if he was still experiencing some things there. OEL and Kulikov playing in the top 4, while Montour and Ekblad were recovering from their injuries too. So that's another thing. And even a 13th forward like a Ryan Lomberg, who is having a hard time getting his game going, getting into the lineup. He doesn't have the broken hand that he did last year in going into the final neither. Remember, he had to wear a glove that was above his size too there. And Josh Mahura can't crack the lineup neither for the Panthers too. And there's more depth there. So it seems like this time around for the Panthers, when you're considering the no extended period time off, the fact that both teams have that, it seems as if this time around for them, it seems like maybe a better circumstance for them going into this Stanley Cup Final. How are you seeing that?
It's night and day. the way it looks right now, roster wise, the Panthers have been very fortunate to this point in the playoffs with no long term major injuries except Sam Bennett. But I tweeted about this the other day. That turned out to be kind of a blessing in disguise because Anton Lundell got moved up when Bennett was hurt and absolutely exploded and found his game, and he hasn't trailed off at all since Bennett's been back. So that ended up working out in the Panthers' favor, and now Bennett is healthy. He seems to have fresher legs than everybody else, given that he had some time off during the playoffs, and he kind of carried the Panthers to the finish line against the Rangers in that series with goals pretty much down the stretch in every game. So there's that factor, but it just if we dive into some of the injuries the Panthers were dealing with last year, it's night and day difference this season. What we're able to take into the final, and not just the guys that are available to play, but what percentage of their game they're able to bring. Because while we weren't missing necessarily a ton of guys in the final last year, the guys we did have playing were nowhere near 100%, and this year we're a lot closer to that. And the depth is another thing, but just from the top down, like Sam Bennett last year had ankle and shoulder injuries that he was dealing with.
He was quiet about it too. He didn't say anything to the coaching staff.
Didn't say a word, but Paul Maurice said that he saw him struggling to put his pads on and take his pads off before and after games. Aaron Ekblad had the broken foot, had the dislocated shoulder, had to pass concussion protocol at one point in last year's playoffs. He's been relatively healthy this time around to our knowledge. Matthew Tkachuk had the sternum injury this year. He seems healthy. Eetu Luostarinen was a massive part of last year's team, and his role is going to be huge against Edmonton because that defensive shutdown forward is going to be so crucial against that team. Last year he had a broken leg and couldn't play, and all these things. When these injuries happened last year, we just didn't have the depth to step in. When Eetu goes out, the next man up was Zach Dalpe. Zach Dalpe is not even in consideration right now for a roster spot on the ice, and it's not a knock on him. He's a respected veteran, longtime AHL guy, the captain of our AHL team, and last year scored a massive goal against Boston to essentially keep our season alive. But that's not something you expect from Zach Dalpe. He's not a guy that you can just plug in and play. Grigory Denisenko played games last year. To this day, he still hasn't scored an NHL goal.
Giovanni Smith too.
Giovanni Smith played, and yeah, these are guys that you don't expect to play. And Radko Gudas gets hurt in a game against Vegas last year, and the next man up is Casey Fitzgerald. Casey Fitzgerald spent a lot of the season buried on the Charlotte Checkers depth chart. Didn't get a crack at the NHL level. So the difference is night and day right now, health wise, depth wise. It's even better. The Panthers have, realistically, they've got three good forwards that aren't playing every game and two good defensemen that aren't playing every game. You have options, and one really, really good goaltender that's not suiting up every game. You've got options, and it helps to have that depth because it's a war of attrition in the playoffs. And right now we've been fortunate, but still one likely long series to go. You don't know how much of that depth is going to be tested. And I think the Panthers are in a good spot if it is.
Yeah, I just had a little bit of a flashback when you spoke about Gudas, that hit by Barbashev and that whiplash on the ice too. That hurt. Just thinking about that hurt me. Thinking about that. So, also, I know I mentioned this. The Florida Panthers have played one more playoff game going into the Stanley Cup Final versus last year, but there are more minutes logged from last year's playoff run. Last year, the Panthers had 7 overtime wins. This year, the Panthers have 2, but 4 overall. But not as many minutes are logged. You basically played that extra game in Game 1 of the Eastern Conference Final last year, too. So that's another thing that the Panthers might have in a little bit of some better circumstances, too, going into this. And also, let's consider this. Morning skates last year were at the arena. These guys were going back home 25, 30 minutes, and then getting their nap and then going back, whatever their routine is. Now that morning skates and practices are in Fort Lauderdale and the houses are closer, you are taking that commute time and shortening it. So the team is likely more rested too, going into it too. So that's another thing. So they don't always have to go on 595 west to the arena to get there too, multiple times a day too. And forget about it if they're going to the ice den too in Coral Springs. So that's another way of navigating things throughout South Florida. I mean, it takes an hour to get from one side of the county to the other, depending on the day. So that lack of commute time too for the Panthers with the practice facility being open, that's another way of it being a better circumstance going into the Stanley Cup Final.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. And some of those little things that you don't think too much about really play a big role in a series like this, because one thing that's been discussed is this is going to be the farthest distance between two Stanley Cup contenders in Stanley Cup Final history. Sunrise, Florida to Edmonton is a very, very long way. And yes, these guys, they travel in comfort. Their planes are nicer than anything that most of us get on. But at the end of the day, that's still a very long flight.
Yeah.
Flights are not comfortable, especially after a hard fought game in the Stanley Cup Final. People are banged up, people are tired, people are bruised, exhausted. Those flights aren't fun. It's not going to be the most enjoyable experience. So having that extra rest advantage at home, being the home team in this series, and having the advantage of getting, if there is a game 7, having a game 7 at home where you get to fly home and be in your routine at your house with your family, and at your practice facility. That's a big advantage when a team like Edmonton is going to have to fly all the way from Edmonton into South Florida in the hotel, and it's just a different setup for them. And I think any rest advantage you can possibly get, whether it's the shorter commute time, the closer practice facility, any rest advantage you can get in this series is going to be huge, just because of the massive distance, the massive travel distance, the time zone change. There's a lot of factors here at play that could throw off the schedule, throw off the recovery. And I think the Panthers they're in a good spot when they're home, when they're at home, they're in a really good spot, being able to manage that and hopefully carry that onto the road. And with that said, I'm not super concerned about the time off, given that both teams are having the same amount of time off. And we saw last year, maybe it affected Bobrovsky's rhythm a little bit, having so much time off. But this season, I think it's more likely to affect Stuart Skinner than it is to affect Sergei Bobrovsky. That's just my gut feeling. Bob's been here before in this exact situation. This is a first for Stuart Skinner as far as this goes, and I think it's more likely to affect him. So just a couple things to think about when it comes to that time off and that rest factor.
Going back to relating to our first segment about experience, so I guess it definitely does matter in this circumstance for the Panthers, but also if you are at home for the Cats, maybe the fact that you have to get tickets for your family too, maybe that might be a little bit of a distraction, but something hopefully that the Panthers are able to manage while they're at home through the Stanley Cup Final, versus trying to get some of them over to Edmonton too, if their families do decide to travel and if their passports are updated, obviously. But Jacob, I want to thank you so much for joining me on this edition of the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast. Tell everybody where they can follow you online, my friend.
Yep, you can follow me on X at Jacob Winans 8. I will be super active there throughout this series and into the off season. It's right around the corner, but we got some business to handle first.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, my friend, and I will see you next week.
Looking forward to it.
And if you like what you're hearing, please subscribe to the podcast to be notified every single time the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast jumps into your podcast feed. Don't forget to also subscribe to the other shows on the Locked On NHL network, including Locked On NHL, Locked On Fantasy Hockey, Flip Livingstone, and Stu Roden, and Locked On NHL Prospects. Thank you once again for making the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast your first listen of the day. So I'm Armando Velez with Jacob Winans, and you've been listening to the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, We're your team every day.